Well, good evening.
I see it in writing.
Thank you for coming. My name is Richie Doyle. Proud to be the president of the Travelers Rest chapter of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. And I hope you're all members of our chapter. We had, I think you are, a lot of you, and I encourage you to consider joining the National Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation as well. We often have brochures, we've run out of them, about the National Foundation. But you can talk to me if you're interested in joining. But I'm glad tonight we have Missoula Community Access Television here to record the program for recablecast on local cable TV. It'll be edited and produced and airing on local TV, and copies will be available at MCAT as well as you can watch it on YouTube coming up in the near future. That is our program tonight with Carrie Forsman. It's great to see all of you here. Next month, we had a dinner meeting tonight, and we were wondering who's our speaker going to be for next month. And we all decided, as we enjoyed last month, there were 80 of us here enjoying Great Journey West on our big screen, that National Geographic video production. And now that we have this giant screen and sound system, etc., and projector, thanks to Bob Cumming, who's here tonight, we decided next January to show one of my favorite films about Carl Bodmer. He came up to Missouri about 30 years after Lewis and Clark with Prince Maximilian. He was hired by the prince as the artist, and he was quite the artist, remarkable. And it's called Views of the Vanishing Frontier. It's 58 minutes long, and we're going to be showing this wonderful film. I think it's January 5th, first Thursday of January. Jean? 4th. January 4th. In February, Kevin O'Brien, who's here tonight, will be speaking for our chapter. And some of you maybe have taken his class with Molly last spring. Kevin is an archaeologist and has developed some very interesting programs regarding the history of Lewis and Clark. There's Kevin. Hey. And in March, we're going to have Stephen Lukert, formerly with the Montana Missoula Arts Museum, speaking about artists in Montana from 1810 to 1945, which should be pretty good. Scott Sproul, our former president, introduced some ideas to our chapter because we're looking for speakers, not only later this year, but next year and such, that perhaps we can cultivate and mentor members of our own chapter, as other chapters do, regarding topics of their interest, if they're interested, if any one of you are interested in speaking for our chapter or has anything in mind. We have a list that you can get from Scott. He's back there at the table of all the talks we've given. We've presented here for the last 15 years. But it's the most challenging thing that our chapter does, is to find a lot of appropriate speakers and good speakers. But we lucked out tonight. And I want to thank Sterling Miller, one of our board of directors. He came up with this idea of having Carrie Forsman speak for us tonight, and I'll let Sterling tell you why. Thank you, Sterling.
I got a lot of mouth. Thank you, Richie. I'm really honored to introduce tonight Dr. Carrie Forsman, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Montana. He taught mammalogy there for over 25 years, and prior to that he taught mammalogy at University of Rhode Island and University of Tennessee. He also did, like me, was an undergraduate student here at the University of Montana. And for those of you who don't know, the University of Montana Wildlife Biology Program, of which Kerry is a distinguished member, is ranked #1 in the country by academic analytics. That is really better than our hat. And also, it's one of 3 programs, distinguished programs identified by the University of Montana that we have on campus. So Kerry was a key component of those of Montana's reputation in that program. He also is the author of The Mammals of Montana, which is now in its 2nd edition, and I asked him to bring some copies here, which Gene will sell if anybody is interested in getting that. And I suspect you'll be able to get Kerry to sign it for you after the presentation. So you can see Kerry's title there. I won't repeat it, although I will comment that for a meat and potatoes biologist, Kerry has a very elegant choice in fonts.
Can you hear me with this now? I normally speak in an auditorium with 400 people, and I don't use a speaker system. So it's okay. I'm usually quite loud. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. It's kind of chilly out there. I've noticed a difference just in the last couple days, and I'm appreciative of everybody making the effort to come out. What I want to talk about tonight, I'll just kind of explain the title really quickly here, how Lewis and Clark's observations affected Montana wildlife species for better or worse. And I think we can all agree that the Lewis and Clark expedition was just phenomenal. I mean, it was an incredible success. So much information was learned during that travel. I need to get my changer here. It was such an incredible success. But when I say for better or worse, what I really mean by this is that it brought an incredible amount of attention to Montana for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And because of that, over the years following the expedition, with the influx of trappers and then miners and then the cattle industry, wildlife suffered greatly. Okay, so Lewis and Clark only for the worse, brought attention to this region, which was, again, welcomed by Thomas Jefferson. And from that standpoint, you know, again, did a phenomenal job. But we paid for it. The wildlife paid for it. Okay, get this going. And very quickly, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a lot of this, but you know, the charge to Lewis from Thomas Jefferson was to really explore the Missouri River, come up the river and take copious notes of everything. I mean, from the course of the river to the environment, okay, and to look for a way to the West Coast, obviously. And so, you know, that was the initial charge, but associated with that was to take note of the landscape of the country, the soil, the face of the country, its growth and vegetable productions, because, you know, Thomas Jefferson, having just obtained the Louisiana Purchase, was looking at allowing the country to expand into this region. And he wanted to know, you know, what was going to be available throughout this country that would make that possible. And one of the third things, and of course there were many, but one of the third things that really precipitated this expedition was to look for economic opportunities. The fur industry was doing already begun in Canada, and there were some you know, information coming back from this particular region, you know, that wildlife might be abundant. And Thomas Jefferson wanted to know whether there would be some support for the fur industry in this region, and whether or not the Missouri and the movement of furs from this region down to St. Louis and the East Coast would be feasible, rather than circumnavigating, coming around on the ocean to the Washington coast, which was being done prior to Lewis and Clark's expedition from a variety of different groups. And so they wanted to know whether or not the Missouri River and this area would not only support the fur industry, but allow furs to be moved back down to St. Louis. And so there were a lot of things on Lewis's plate, everything. And what's so interesting is the fact that, of course, Lewis was very well schooled and very well trained for someone in the time, and was, approached this from quite a scientific angle. And that's what's so important about the expedition. What I want to do is kind of put things in context. And there's a lot of controversy, and a lot of what I'm going to say talks about numbers, populations of people, or populations of wildlife. And you have to recognize back in the 1700s, that I'll start with, and early 1800s, there were no means of taking population censuses of people, let alone of wildlife. You didn't have a Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department flying, over the range counting animals. And so you had observations, again, from Lewis and Clark, of the numbers of animals that they saw in a general sense. There are many ways you can extrapolate that kind of information with caveats to get a general idea of the numbers of animals. And it's when I start throwing out some numbers like 10 million of this or 30 million of this particular species, it doesn't matter whether it were 10 million or 30 million. There were a lot. Okay, and so the information that was being transmitted back to the United States from this expedition demonstrated that wildlife, for the most part, was quite abundant throughout this region. If we go back to the 1700s, early 1700s, before Lewis and Clark, of course, came through this region in the early 1800s, there were people here, of course, and again, the numbers don't really matter. We recognize that there were a large number of different Native American tribes in Montana. In the early 1700s, these were recognized. The Kootenai, Flathead, Salish, and Kalispel. These tribes, these tribal units, have as their tribal legend an origin in this region. So they amongst themselves, oral tradition is that they developed in this particular area. In the early 1700s, the Blackfoot Nation and subgroups in the Canadian provinces, what would become, of course, the Canadian provinces, started to expand into Montana, as did the Gros Ventre. The Shoshone came up from the Great Basin. So in the 1700s, they were centered down here, but started to expand into what we now see as present-day Montana. The Assiniboine, the Sioux, the Crow were historically in the North Dakota region, and they were expanding westward. So they were starting to move into this particular region, and the Cheyenne were coming up from the Great Basin from the south and Wyoming. My point is that there were Native American tribes here across the state, but what you have to recognize is the best estimates, and again, these are estimates, but from oral tradition, etc., in the early 1700s, there were roughly around 20,000 Native Americans thought to inhabit this particular area, what we now consider Montana. And you also have to recognize that for the most part, they were nomadic. I mean, they would be centered in villages for certain periods of time, but they would move seasonally. They would move with wildlife populations or plant growth cycles. Okay, so they weren't static. They weren't, developing large cities or anything like that, that we envision. They were here, but they were relatively few in number. Okay, historically in this region, there were more before the 1700s, but started to see various diseases hit even in the 1600s and then later in the 1700s, smallpox. So the populations fluctuated, but the best estimates were that around 20,000 or so. My point is that that's not very many people for an area the size of Montana, and this was prior to horses. Okay, horses weren't didn't come into Montana, brought into Montana until the first event is around 1730, 1735, and really didn't become established with the Crow or these other groups until much later than that in the 1700s. So we're dealing with a small number of Native American populations, predominantly nomadic, and again following seasonal events, and because at the time they didn't have horses, though they could impact wildlife with buffalo jumps, and get a fairly significant number of bison in a particular event, but would not really dent the bison population or other species very much at all. Not enough from a wildlife standpoint, given the numbers of wildlife and individuals that existed. So back in the 1700s, in this region, it was different along the Colombian coast. Native American populations, or down in the Southwest, there might have been larger groups of individuals. But up here, essentially, you have to understand that wildlife, from what we understand, was relatively abundant, and the impact on those wildlife species was relatively small. In 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase occurred, you can see, here's the Louisiana Purchase, of course, and the current state of the United States here. Lewis was charged with going up the Missouri River and finding a route to the West Coast. And particularly we'll focus in on the region that we're here in right now, in the Montana region. But he was moving across this landscape, again taking copious notes, interacting with the natives, and trying to really understand the lay of the land, the wildlife, the opportunities that existed, and the landscape, for further growth. One of the things that's fascinating when you look at the actual journals, and I'm sure many of you have, if not most, when you really look at the journals, what strikes you, and strikes me anyway, is that Lewis in particular was very astute in his observations. And again, he didn't embellish things when you see some of the later reports, and we'll talk about those in just a few minutes. They embellished the story, and Lewis didn't do that. Lewis was a scientist, and he really looked at the landscape and the animals with a scientific eye. And this is an interesting description. I'll just give you this one, but this is obviously a badger, and this was not known. And obviously known to the natives. That's what's interesting. We talk about Lewis and Clark discovering roughly 122 new species. Okay, they were discovered by Europeans and described scientifically, but the natives had been living with them for hundreds and hundreds of years. But Lewis and Clark, described 122 species and subspecies of animals, let alone plants, and a large percentage were out here. Okay, 65, over half of these species that they identified as new were west of the Continental Divide. And this is one of them. And this description is interesting because you look at this, and this is a description. This animal burrows in the ground and feeds on bugs and flesh, principally of the little dogs of the prairie kind, prairie dogs. Okay, so they feed on prairie dogs. Shape and size is like that of a beaver. His head and mouth is like that of a dog with its ears cut off. Okay, his tail and hair are like that of a groundhog. His skin and the white hairs are like a bear, which it surely is, okay? And then he goes on and describes how long the claws are. I mean, that's a pretty detailed description. I mean, if you didn't have this picture in front of you and you had that description, you had a pretty good idea of what this animal looked like. So, their observations were really quite good. And though they didn't embellish things, these observations that were transmitted back to St. Louis, or surely once the journals were published, really piqued everybody's interest. I mean, this was fascinating to see these new animals, learn of these. And I'm going to do this just for a few points to drive this one point home here. This was one day in the journal. This was on September 18th, 1804 in South Dakota. They'd come up the Missouri, and on this day they went to shore, and this is what they described. I walked on shore, saw goats, these are pronghorn that he's talking about, pronghorn antelope. Walked on shore, saw goats, elk, buffalo, black-tailed deer, and the common deer, white-tailed deer. Killed a prairie wolf, in this case it was a coyote, okay, the way he describes it here. And the large wolves are very numerous, so he's also talking about gray wolves. Great many porcupine, rabbits, barking squirrels, which are prairie dogs, in this quarter. And the day before this description, he talks about seeing striped skunks. So think about this for a minute. Today, you're in a kayak or a canoe, and you're on the Missouri River in this region of South Dakota, and you pull to shore, and you get out and spend a few hours on shore. Do you think you're going to see all these species? Okay, I mean, it's remarkable to think, and this is day after day after day in large numbers of the locations. Okay, saw all these species: mule deer, white-tailed deer, pronghorn, coyotes, various hares. These are he's calling rabbits. They would have been hares. The wolves themselves. Okay, and the coyote, I think I mentioned, prairie dogs, striped skunk, porcupines, elk, buffalo. Just in one, few hours walking around on that particular day. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but look at this. This was just 1 week, day after day after day. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, okay? Saw a great many buffalo and elk on the banks. Got elk and a deer. Killed an elk, some geese the next day. Laid here, killed 3 elk, got a number of geese the next day. Saw a great number of elk, buffalo, deer on both sides. 2 of our hunters went out and caught 3 young buffalo calves the next day. The next day, caught some beaver. The next day, killed 3 black-tailed deer and a buffalo calf. I mean, this day after day after day. Surely there were large periods when they didn't see animals, and there's a lot of reason that occurred. But this kind of information was accurate and ultimately was transmitted back to the East Coast and, caught everyone's attention. Just a couple through Montana, because we were in the Dakotas before. In Montana, you see the same type of thing. Over here by Wolf Point, okay, the entry when they got to that region, buffalo, elk, and goats, or antelope, okay, same thing, feeding in every direction. We kill whatever we wish. We have venison beaver tails whenever we wish. Found a den of young wolves, and they saw coyotes and wolves, both species, okay. Captain Clark and Dwyer killed the largest brown bear this evening we've ever seen. The party killed 2 elk and a buffalo today, and my dog caught a pronghorn. That's 1 day, okay? So wouldn't you get excited? I mean, if you're back east and you want to hunt, you want to trap, and you get this kind of information coming back saying, look what's out here, okay? 2 more, and then we'll continue here. Down at Three Forks, okay? So this is Three Forks, okay? July 25th, 1805. At this location, all the watercourses in this quarter, immense number of beaver and otter. Many thousand inhabit the river and creeks near the Three Forks. If you're sitting back in St. Louis and you're interested in trapping and you know the price of fur going to the European market, and you are told that there's an immense number of beaver and otter, you do something about it. Okay? This is what this region looks like today. This was last summer when I came through, and this is the Three Forks. This is the Gallatin as the Three Forks converge. Looks pretty much like it did 200 plus years ago. And we'll come back to that. And the last one, just because it's such a focus here, if you stick your head out the front door and look to your left, okay, we're at Lolo Creek here. This creek is very much dammed up with the beaver, okay? So over and over and over, it's just kind of reinforcing this thought. So this information got back to St. Louis after the expedition, and of course Lewis and Clark's original journals weren't published then, not for 7 years, but Patrick Gass's information was, okay, and this was an original copy. This was published in 1807, okay, and this was his journal that he kept. He was the first one to use the term Corps of Discovery. And this was the original journal, okay? At the time, it sold for $1. You can buy this one now. I can't afford it. But you can actually buy this edition that was published in 1807. I wish I could afford that. But this was the first information other than newspaper articles and interviews, that occurred when Lewis and Clark returned in 1806. This was published in 1807. And again, was, very much of the same information. So it was, the detailed information of the expedition. And this is the first real account of the success of the expedition. People just ate this up. What's interesting to see is, at the same time, because there was such an interest in this, as today, there were a lot of alternative facts being thrown around. And there were actually 9 different books published right after the expedition. Okay, this was published in 1809. There were at least 9 different books published by different individuals. And they were the travels of Lewis and Clark. Okay, but they were based on news clippings. They were based on other explorations that had nothing to do with Lewis and Clark. Okay, they just took that information and embellished. Okay, they were the ones that were bringing up these alternative facts and making it much more exciting than the scientific approach that Lewis and Clark had produced. So this also really piqued everybody's interest, and so you're getting a lot of people and support from even the government to move west and take advantage of this new country. Lewis and Clark's journals weren't published until 1814, and they really weren't widely acclaimed. Everybody had been there, done that. We've already seen these reports for the last 6-7 years. We've read a lot about it, and this was useful, obviously, to people who were really involved in going up the Missouri. But it was interesting that it wasn't that widely acclaimed, simply because of all of the other information that was produced before. Kind of sad from that standpoint. But obviously, this is the Holy Grail. I mean, this is the information that's really quite detailed and important. This information, from 1806 that got back, really, again, piqued everybody's interest. There were a lot of Europeans in Canada in the late 1700s, early 1800s, moving across, particularly Hudson's Bay Company trappers. So it's not as though no Europeans had been in Montana before, but it was sparse. There were a few trappers coming into this region from the provinces above, wouldn't have been provinces then, but from British Columbia and Saskatchewan, Alberta, coming down into Montana looking for wildlife and doing some trapping. So there was some interest in coming down and really seeing what was going on. But with the reports, the detailed reports and voluminous reports that Lewis and Clark produced, the rush was on, okay? And it really had to do with the fur industry, of course. The European groups in Europe and Asia, throughout Russia, those regions, have been collecting fur for hundreds and hundreds of years, okay? It was a staple over there. And beaver in particular were really quite important in the European market. And as I'll show you in just a minute, the beaver in Europe had pretty much gone extinct because of the trapping pressure. And the Europeans that were still in Europe and the Europeans that were now colonizing the east coast of the U.S. were looking for furs, across this country. So the real driving force were the fur market, and when you see those reports coming back from Lewis and Clark about the number of fur bearers that they saw and the other species that they saw, you recognize that it was worth the effort to go out there. These are the forts that were set up following Lewis and Clark's expedition. So just think about this for a minute. Lewis and Clark, came through 1804 to 1806. The first fort, the U.S., United States fort from U.S. population, was Fort Manuel Lisa, right here. This was established in 1807 and ran for 4 years. Okay, so a year after Lewis and Clark, Fort Lisa was established, Manuel Lisa, and from that time on, look at all of the different forts and fur trapping units, posts, were established in Montana during the 1800s. I mean, a huge number came in. You can see the different dates here, but it extended across most of the 1800s. There were some fairly early ones. David Thompson and Northwest Company, the Canadian group. David Thompson was coming down, of course. He was establishing forts in 1809, 1808, right in that time frame. And it's interesting because this, of course, now is part of the Louisiana Purchase. So this is U.S. territory, but nobody recognized the boundaries. The northern boundary here was established fairly soon after the Louisiana Purchase to the Rocky Mountains, okay? Identifying this as the border between Canada and the U.S. The border further on from east of the Rockies over to the west coast took longer to survey and wasn't established. But this was known, quote unquote known, to be U.S. territory by then, but it didn't matter to the Hudson Bay Company, the Northwest Company, and the trappers, the Canadian and British, French-Canadian trappers in the north. So they continually came down into Montana to essentially steal furs and take them back up to Canada and across through the Hudson's Bay region. But my point here is that, you know, following this expedition and the reports that were being garnered from even other sources, you can see the tremendous influx over the next 100 years of trappers and established trapping groups coming into the state, it wasn't a state then, coming into this region to look for these furs. The real driving force initially was beaver, okay? This was the gold that everybody wanted. This is what the Europeans really needed to maintain their industry. And again, the estimates, and there are lots of different ways to generate these estimates, but you can see the outliers here, 60 to 400 million. That's kind of a range. But it doesn't matter whether it's 60 million or 400. That's a lot of beaver, okay? And so it doesn't matter if it's only 30 million. Those are a large number of animals to take advantage of. And Montana, as you'll see, Montana has nearly 60,000 miles of streams. I mean, we're blessed with that. If you haven't known it, buy a kayak and go out, see for yourself. We have 60,000 miles of streams in Montana. Probably 95% support beaver, or did back then. I mean, you know, beaver's a rodent. It's really adaptable. It just needs clean water and vegetation, and it does extremely well. So when Lewis and Clark came across, you know, this region, they saw large numbers of beaver, they ate large numbers, and recognized this as a source. Beaver were, as I said, incredibly important in the European market. They'd been trapped since the 9th and 10th centuries across Europe and Asia. They've been used for clothing. The felting process was developed back in the 9th century. The felting process to put the hairs together, the underfur of the beaver, to allow those hairs to seal up and produce a very thick, dense coat, okay? They were used for armor, lots of warmth for a coat. And then as we got into the, you know, the 16 and 1700s, they were the rage of the day. They were hats, felted, beaver felted hats. And that was incredibly important. That was a status symbol, and everybody had these types of hats. As I said before, in the trapping industry in Europe, the felting process was actually even developed further in the 17th century in Russia, to the point where this material was you know, better than any type of cloth that could be made available. So it was really an important commodity, but so important, as I said before, that the Europeans trapped out their beaver population. The beaver, there's a European species that's pretty close to this one. You'd have a hard time telling them apart, but they're differences, but they're pretty close to the American beaver. And they were trapped essentially to extinction in Europe. And so all of a sudden, you know, the markets were collapsing, but the need was still there, the desire. And so the impetus to get to North America and start trapping beaver. These numbers are hard to come by. You go back into the trapping companies' records from the 1800s. They're not easy to come by, but if you find some of this information, you'll begin to appreciate the numbers of animals. This was just the Hudson Bay Company. So this was the Canadian company that was kind of dipping down into Montana to get animals. And between this early period, 1808 to 1828, just castoreum. Castor is the oil in a couple of the glands, the castor glands that beaver have. They've got different sets of glands, anal glands and castor glands. But the castor glands produce oil called castoreum. And this was used for foods. Until recently, until 10 years ago, it was in a lot of our foods, these gland materials. And they're used for a whole variety of other purposes. But it was a product that was really highly sought after, besides the fur, besides the hide and the fur. And just during this short period of time, the 10 tons of castoreum were obtained, from beaver. And if you figure out how much oil is produced by a single beaver in these glands, that translates out to about 107,000 beaver, just for the castoreum. Of course, they used the carcasses and the pelts as well. But just gives you a sense of the numbers of animals that were being collected in relatively short periods of time. Just prior to 1812, war obviously broke out, and Hudson's Bay was having trouble getting their ships, out to Britain, and so they sent a large number of furs to try to beat the blockade. They sent 200,000 pounds of beaver pelts out. At the time, this was roughly $17 million worth of pelts to Europe. Not bad back in 1812. And the market for beaver, which was really driving the fur trade and bringing all these people into this particular region, the market started to crash in the 1850s because of the silk trade. All of a sudden, the beaver hats were kind of out of style, and silk was now being developed and processed and being used for a variety of other things. And there was a shift from the beaver pelts and the felting associated with it to silk and other materials that were being developed at the time. So the market was really starting to go down. But even then, even after this market was declining, in 1854 alone, 500,000 pelts, beaver pelts, were sent to London. That's just the Hudson's Bay Company. That's not all of these other forts that you saw on that map. Hudson's Bay was up in Canada. They weren't established in this region. And between 1853 and 1877, after the market pretty much collapsed, they were still sold over 3 million pelts. And that's, again, just Hudson's Bay. The Northwest Company, which was a Canadian company as well, the Missouri Fur Company, the American Fur Company, which became the Pacific Fur Company, these were all U.S. companies, and they were also, trapping large numbers of beaver. And I don't have all of those records. The point being, tremendous impact on beaver populations, and the beaver took a dive, And what's interesting, and I don't have enough time to really talk about all of the different legislation that occurred in Montana, but what's so interesting, I use this kind of as the focus for a Molly class that I just taught at the university over 6 weeks, where I had a little bit more time. What's so interesting is when you look at the legislative efforts in Montana, before Montana was even a state, when it was a territory and then became a state, the territorial legislature and the state legislature implemented significant conservation efforts to protect wildlife. This was back in the 1860s, started in the 1860s. And Granville Stewart, whom the name should surely ring a bell. Granville Stewart was kind of a man of many, many trades. He had a trade store during part of his life to service the miners and the ranchers. He was a trapper himself. He was a miner himself. He was on the territorial legislature and then the state legislature for many, many years. Heavily involved in this state. Essentially called Mr. Montana, if you look at a lot of these books. And in 1869, okay, on the legislature, territorial legislature, he produced legislation to protect beaver populations. I mean, this is Montana in the 1800s, and he's raising his hand and saying, we have to protect the beaver. They're disappearing. They're being overtrapped, okay? They're important as a resource. They do lots of good things for waterways, okay? He even recognized that at the time. And he proposed legislation to try to protect this species. To me, that's just hard to fathom back in that period of time. In 1876, he pursued this even further, and he got legislation passed to protect beaver from April 1st to August 1st. So this is the breeding season, and he recognized, you know, we need to keep this species in the state. We need to maintain these populations, and this is a way to protect them. I mean, there was no Fish and Game Department. There were no wardens, not for another 30 or 40 years. Was there any way to control people from trapping beaver? But the legislature passed these laws to try to protect the species. And they made it totally illegal to kill beaver in the territory, okay? And you know, recognized that private landowners should have some role in removing them if they were destroying their trees along their riverside or something like that. But to me, this is more like something that you'd think about in, you know, 1982 or 1990, not in 1876. The minute you do that, this species comes back rapidly. This is a rodent, okay? They live very long. Beaver live up to 20 plus years. They have 3 to 4 young, okay? And they're rodents, so they eat, you know, vegetation, and they mature relatively rapidly. The point is they can recover quite rapidly if you give them a chance. If they have fresh water and they're not killed on site, you know, they're going to come back and do quite well. They were trapped out of the state, and by these are recent censuses and ballpark estimates. Doesn't again matter to the finite number here, but the 1984 population in the U.S. is roughly about 2 million. Okay, more now, I'm sure. And across North America, the estimates were 6 to 12 million. So, you know, they're doing quite well, and as we know that here, they're still in Lolo Creek. You can walk out. You probably get, if you live around here, they're probably eating trees in your yard. So they're a common species. But they were essentially trapped out in the early to mid 1800s. Montana has an incredible conservation ethic, and they have since the 1860s, and we'll reinforce that here. I want to talk about several species. You know, we hear about bison a lot, the tens of millions of bison that, you know, essentially were extirpated down to just a few hundred. We hear about the grizzly bears going extinct. We hear about the wolves being trapped out to extinction. And I'm not going to go there until the very last slide or two, but I want to highlight a few other species that we don't normally think about that were quite abundant in Montana, in this region, during the early part of the, well, surely in the 1700s, early part of the 1800s, but then with the influx of trappers and then the mining and the agricultural and cattle industries coming in, these populations were simply decimated. Here's another example. Jump back to Lewis and Clark. April 25th, 1805, okay? The whole face of the country was covered with herds of buffalo, elk, and antelope. Antelope were so gentle that we pass near them, Antelope were so gentle that we passed near them while feeding without appearing to excite alarm amongst them, and when we attract their attention, they frequently approach us. See what happens when you come up the Missouri River, say over in eastern Montana, and get out and walk up on the plains to see the antelope. How many do you think are going to come up and rub noses with you? Okay? It's not going to happen. But it did back here. They were very, very common, and they weren't well known at all. This is a book that was published back in 2004, and I simply throw this, well, for two reasons. First, one of the authors, Bart O'Gara, a few of you may recognize that name. Bart was a professor at the university. He'd gotten his PhD working on pronghorn. That was his dissertation on pronghorn. And he was a professor at the university, and he was the head of the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit. Okay, he followed John Craighead as head of the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit. Very well-known scientist, and Bart was an authority on pronghorn. They published this book, Prairie Ghost, Pronghorn and Human Interactions in Early America. And this is a picture from Wyoming. This is a real picture. And the estimates in the book were that bison were more abundant, that pronghorn were more abundant than bison on the Great Plains. Okay, and again, I'm not going to split hairs here as to how many millions there might have been. Some of the estimates were 10 to 40 million pronghorn. Okay, doesn't matter to me whether it was 10 million or 40. That's a lot of pronghorn. And what's interesting is this was in the estimates for the 1700s, early 1800s. In Bozeman alone, in 1874, 12,000 hides were shipped back just in this one year, and this was kind of toward the tail end of everything. The hides were used for leather, for the industrial industry, as were the bison hides. But my point is, by 1900, in Montana, the estimate, and these are now, scientific estimates, not just, we'll wave our arms and think there's a few out there, okay? There were started to have some decent censusing studies done, and by 1900 they figured there were roughly 3,000 animals in Montana. The entire U.S. population was about 13,000, okay, from a large number. So they were essentially knocked down, not to extinction, but heavily decimated across the 1800s. Again, this state, not only in the late 1860s, early 1870s, started conservation efforts, they actually passed legislation in the 70s and 1880s to protect these types of species as well, pronghorn and bison and some of the larger game species, to set up hunting limits, to set up times, to protect the animals during the breeding season and have seasonal hunts on these animals. These were proposed legislative times for the protection of these species. And once Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks was formed in the late 1800s, very early part of 1900, once that agency was formed and game wardens were hired, we started to see a lot of efforts, more structured efforts to save these species. This was interesting. The first transplants that occurred for pronghorn were back in 1911, and they were moving pronghorn from Gardner up to the National Bison Range, which had just been formed a few years earlier to save the bison, which were down to just a few hundred animals in the U.S. And this was done by the Boone and Crockett Club. They arranged for this transplantation to occur up to the Bison Range to try to protect pronghorn, and throughout the early 1900s, 40s and 50s, and even more recently, a large number of animals, about 5,000 pronghorn, have been transplanted around Montana to supplement, populations that weren't doing so well. My point being that we'd gone through a period of heavy harvest, okay, unregulated harvest in the 1800s, and once people moved into the area, and once it was recognized that these populations were declining rapidly, they made every effort to try to protect these species, and did very well. The other point that I'll mention here, this was enhanced by the Boone and Crockett Club back in 1911. The driving force behind a lot of this legislation and a lot of the early transplantation efforts, there were other animal transplants, there were elk transplants earlier than this from Gardner, even up into this region, up into the Bitterroots, from Gardner to the Bitterroots by train, and predominantly by train, bringing elk up to the Bitterroots, okay, to enhance the populations here, because there were too many elk down in the Gardner region back in the 1908 to 1910, that time period. But the point is, a lot of these efforts were being driven not only by organized clubs like the Boone and Crockett Club, but by local hunting groups, the hunting clubs. There were hunting clubs in almost every town that was being established in Montana. Butte had a hunting club, Missoula had a hunting club, Stevensville did, Hamilton did back in 1900 and even in the late 1800s. So all of these small towns had hunting clubs, and it was the hunters that were the real driving force behind the transplants that were begun. They were the ones paying for them. I mean, you have to recognize before 1900, there was no Fish and Game Department, okay, that was really effective, and no wardens. Okay, they were just starting to be established, but there was no real structure there to support these types of efforts, and that was being driven by the local hunting clubs and then the conservation organizations that started to develop. Pronghorn, you know, today we're still dealing with this issue. This picture was taken just a few months ago, and this is over in Phillips County, the Nature Conservancy, and there's still a lot of effort to protect pronghorn. The biggest problem right now with these populations is that, you know, we recognize they're a migratory species. So pronghorn migrate just like bison do, okay, just like elk populations migrate. And pronghorn, you know, historically have had some fairly long migration routes, several 100-mile migration routes from Canada into Montana or from southern Montana down into Wyoming. Very well established migration routes, and, you know, pronghorn can't jump. In the fencing that has gone up in the 1800s with the cattle industry developing and the sheep herding industry developing, with the fencing that went up, pronghorn migrations were stopped, period. They can't jump a fence that's this high. They're just not built to jump. They'll go under a fence if they can, but they can't jump. So you put up a barbed wire fence like this, and that's it. You know, these animals can't migrate. They'll run miles up and down the fence, and then they'll try to get under it. And what, you know, the efforts today are to try to develop fencing. Here's still a three-stranded, you know, barbed wire fence, but what they're trying to do is cover the bottom strand of barbed wire, or just put a flat strand of wire here without barbs on it, or to take it out completely, okay, cover it in some manner, so that pronghorn can go under it without hurting themselves. Okay. And you can still set it up so cattle can't get through, but the pronghorn can go under a fence like this without this lower wire at 30 miles an hour. It is boom. I mean, they can just float right under that. It's just amazing. And so the real effort today, going on right today over at the Matador Ranch for the Nature Conservancy, is to try to develop fencing, work with the industry, and develop fencing that allows for these migrations to continue unabated and protect this species. This is Great Falls, back to Meriwether Lewis, July 6, 1805. There's a remarkable small fox which associate with in large communities and burrow in the prairies, something like the small wolf, but we have not as yet been able to obtain one of them. Okay? And again, more detailed description. They're very delicately formed, exceedingly fleet, and not as large as a common domestic cat. This big. Okay. Their talons appear longer than any species of fox I ever saw, and seem therefore prepared more amply by nature for the purpose of burrowing. So he's describing a fox-like animal that's you can hold in your hand, you know, that's like a small cat, okay, that burrows underground very well. And of course, what he's describing is a swift fox. This swift fox, very abundant across the grassland plains in Montana, throughout the grasslands of Canada, and down across you know, the Kansas and Wyoming, Nebraska, those regions. The first scientific description was this is 1825, I think it says, and it revised in 1850s by Audubon. Audubon came out here on some expeditions, and of course was an incredible artist. So he would draw these things and actually scientifically describe them. This is a swift fox. They weigh 5 pounds. Okay, if you've got a cat at home, your cat weighs more than this swift fox does. I mean, they look a little bigger because they're just kind of fluffy, okay? But if you know, if you saw them without their fur on, you know, they're about the size of my hand. They're tiny, scrawny little things. They're this big, and they're abundant. They're beautiful, and they've got beautiful pelts, okay? And they're easily trapped. In the mid-1800s, this is just Canada, okay? Because we didn't have the records from the US, but they were down here, trapped to extinction. But in the 1850s to early 70s, 117,000 pelts were obtained by the Hudson's Bay Company up in the Canadian region and sold, okay? This is an adult. This is a kangaroo rat. So you can see the size of these animals. Beautiful little animals, and shouldn't threaten anyone. These are not, you know, like a coyote chasing a sheep, or a wolf, you know, chasing something else, or threatening people, possibly. This was a tiny little cat-sized little fox that just ate rodents. Okay? So it's not a threat to anybody, but they had a nice pelt. Okay? They were trapped out in Montana, totally trapped, extirpated in the state. Between 1918 and 1978, there were absolutely no records of this species at all. I mean, they were trapped out in the 1800s, okay, and there might have been one sighting, and that was an animal that they think came down from Canada. And so they were ultimately classified as extinct formally in 1969. In Canada, where they had been abundant across all the grasslands up there that run for hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 or more miles, they were last seen in 1938 and designated as totally extirpated by 1978. Beautiful species, trapped nearly to extinction. In this region, they were extirpated. They were still present down in the Great Plains region. This is the Blackfoot Reservation, okay, over 1 million acres of grasslands that's prime habitat for this species, and not an animal in sight because they'd been trapped out. The Canadian government took note of this and took the lead on this. They were very interested in the species. They wanted to bring it back. And the other thing that played into this in a large amount was the fact that the swift fox is revered by the Blackfeet. Okay, it's in their oral history. Okay, they're tightly associated with the swift fox. It means a great amount to them. And of course, the Blackfeet have heavy presence up in this region. The Canadian government decided to try to reintroduce this species. They worked with this group, Cochrane Research Institute in Alberta, and this is a breeding facility. And Cochrane actually got animals from the central part of the U.S. that were still present, and set up a breeding facility in Alberta to raise the swift fox in captivity so they could be reintroduced. Reintroduction started in 1983 and 1984 here on the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan, and over here in central Saskatchewan. And between this time period, 80s and mid-90s, nearly 1,000 swift fox were reintroduced from this breeding facility. Okay, real effort to bring this species back. The reintroductions occurred here, and there were so many animals reintroduced, and the grasslands, of course, the animals don't recognize the border between Canada and the U.S., so a lot of those animals moved south across the extensive grasslands that we have here today. So you started to see some of those reintroductions bringing animals back into Montana, you know, that hadn't been seen since at least 1918. There were some natural expansions from the Great Plains of animals, okay, on their own, kind of moving up across the grasslands that are out in the southeastern part of Montana. And then we were specifically involved. We were asked by the Blackfeet tribe and the Defenders of Wildlife to help in the reintroduction efforts with the Blackfeet Reservation here in Montana. Okay, so we, over one of my graduate students and I, over this 5-year period, okay, 4.5 to 5-year period, reintroduced 123 swift fox to this region, okay, just east of Glacier Park on the Blackfeet Reservation. That picture I showed you before, that 1,000,000+ acres of grasslands, that's what it looks like today. It's just beautiful. And it's perfect habitat for this species. And again, it's revered, the species is revered by the Blackfeet. And they're not about to kill them. Okay? They just don't do that. They don't trap these animals. They revere them. And so it was a perfect place to start this reintroduction. So we spent this many years reintroducing animals here, and I had a graduate student monitoring that success and working with them. And then Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, a few years later, started to reintroduce a smaller number of animals over on the Fort Peck Reservation. Okay? Both of these, our transplant efforts have been highly successful. It's one of the most successful reintroduction efforts of any species in the U.S., and they're doing extremely well. This was one of the technicians that was working with my graduate student, and I just wanted to show you this because you can see this animal isn't anesthetized. Okay? Catch them in a live trap, you reach in with a glove on your hand and put a little wrap of actually it's a sock that you wrap around their snout so they don't bite you, nip at you. But you can handle them without tranquilizing them. They're that small and they're docile once you get a hold of them. Okay? And so we would trap these animals, and what we were doing is we transplanted 123 back into this region, but then every year, in fact several times a year, we would live trap the animals, and once litters were produced, we'd catch the young and genetically identify them, take samples for genetics analyses, put radio collars on them, and here's an animal with a radio collar. So we could follow them around, we could look at reproductive output, how successful are they, how are they expanding out across the landscape, etc. And this is the graduate student, Dave Osband, and you can see the habitat, just beautiful. And he's monitoring the animals, he's checking their presence with radio telemetry. And right now, we have over 1,000 swift fox from all of these concerted efforts now spread out across the state. So the point being, they went from totally being extirpated in the state through the 1800s and early 1900s, and with state efforts and all these different agencies and state and federal agencies, they've been brought back. The last species I just want to mention is the fisher. Okay, beautiful animal. This is a mustelid. It's a member of the weasel family. You may be more familiar with the pine marten. Okay, so this is just a little bit bigger than a pine marten. The females are about 6 pounds. The males are about 10 pounds in size. Okay. They're found now, and we've worked throughout the Bitterroots and across Montana, western part of Montana, on this species. And they're a beautiful animal. They are well known for the fact that they're one of the only species, the mountain lion being the other one commonly, the only species that can kill a porcupine. They feed on porcupines. I mean, they'll eat other things, particularly hares, snowshoe hares, but porcupine are something they really like and are good at killing without being hurt themselves. Okay, most of the carnivores, wolves, coyotes, won't even touch them. I mean, if your dog has ever gotten into one, you know why. But fisher have figured this out, and they know how to kill these animals without getting hurt. If you look at the fisher populations, they've been spread across the Canadian provinces down into this region of Minnesota. Minnesota, Wisconsin region, and dip down into Montana historically, and then across the slight region of California, Oregon border. But for the most part, because of the trapping efforts across this region and back east, almost totally extirpated and almost extinct, okay, back in the late 1800s because of all this trapping pressure and into the 1900s. In Montana, it was thought, and this is a long story, so I can't really go there right now, it was originally thought that they were totally extirpated in Montana by about 1920. There were no sightings since 1920 in Montana, and just few remnant populations across these regions and a little bit in Montana. So much so that the entire trapping season for this species throughout the U.S. and Canada was stopped in 1930. Okay? So this is another species that, because of the influx in people into this region in the 1800s and the pressure that continued to build on trapping of these animals, was extirpated from these regions and brought close to extinction. Montana took the lead on bringing this species back, and back in the late 50s, a couple of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks biologists from the Kalispell office up here started to transplant animals from Williams Lake back into Montana. They transplanted a few animals into the Purcells. They put a few more down into the Swan Mountains here east of us, and they put a few more into the Anaconda-Pintler Mountains. This was between 1958 and 1960, okay? Pretty small numbers, and we now recognize today that's not enough to really get the job done. And these didn't take very well, okay? I mean, these populations really didn't get established from this effort. Idaho was trying the same thing. Back in the 60s, they transplanted 39 animals from the same region here down into the Idaho side of the Bitterroots. And we saw actually an influx of some of those animals into Montana through the Bitterroot Range. So essentially, a lot of the animals that we have in the Bitterroots here, I don't know how many of you have seen these. I've seen quite a few with my cameras down through the Bitterroots. Many of those were probably from the Idaho transplant back in the 60s. It's such an important species for a variety of reasons, and one that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks really wanted to reestablish in the state, that I was asked to set up a major transplantation effort. We couldn't get the animals we needed from Canada, which would have been the best situation. They simply didn't have very many animals that they would give us. They said, no, you can't have ours. We don't have very many anyway. But the populations in Minnesota and Wisconsin had rebounded and are actually quite strong back there. So my graduate students and I brought back 110 animals. We went to Minnesota and Wisconsin and trapped 110 males and females, brought them back to Montana over a couple of years, and between 89 and 91, and put them in the Cabinet Mountains. So we put 110 males and females into the cabinets over roughly a 3-year period. I then went back with another graduate student, Ray Vinke, whom some of you may know, and Ray's graduate work with me was to go back up into the cabinets and see how well that transplantation effort that we did 10 years earlier had done. And so he went up there. This is actually a real picture. I mean, it gets a lot of snow up there. And Ray was up there trying to trap Fisher, live trap Fisher, and radio collar them. And of course, the Fisher that we transplanted back in the late 1989, 1991 or so, the Fisher that we transplanted, we took samples from. So we had the genetics for every individual that we transplanted. And so Ray's thesis was to go back into these areas, try to see how many animals he could find, capture, and test, test with DNA so we could recognize, whether these were the sons and daughters or grandsons and daughters of the originals that we transplanted in there. Ray spent several years working in the cabinets looking for these animals. Didn't find very many, okay? It wasn't a very successful transplant, and hindsight is great, but we recognize lots of situations associated with this particular transplant. The animals that we brought in from Minnesota and Wisconsin weren't familiar with all of the predators that we've got out here. Mountain lions, kill them on sight. Wolverines, kill them on sight. Coyotes, go after them. Golden eagles, go after them, okay? And most of those species aren't common or even present back in Minnesota and Wisconsin. There's no mountain lions, there's no wolverines back there. So the animals that we were bringing out here were really quite naive. I mean, they were the top predator back there, okay, in this kind of a group. But when they came out here, they weren't the top predator, and they didn't recognize these other species as the top predator, and were adversely affected by that relationship. The other problem was the snow, okay? This species doesn't do well in deep snow. Back in Minnesota and Wisconsin, you may get 3 or 4 or 5 feet of snow, but it's warm enough back there, so during the day, the snow warms up, and at night when it cools down, it freezes. So you have a heavy crust on this deep snow layer. These animals are small enough, only 6, 8 pounds, they can run across the top of a 3-foot snow layer on that crust. It'll support them. And so they can easily chase snowshoe hares and other species across that deep snow because it's crusted over very well. In the Cabinet Mountains, you get deep snow, but it's always cold. It doesn't warm up during the day, so at night it doesn't freeze. So you've got powder. You've got 2 or 3 feet of powder. And this species can't handle that. It can swim through it, but it can't chase anything for food. And so it goes up on the ridge lines, 11,000-foot peaks up there, to look for food, which there is none. I mean, the hares are down in the woods, okay? And so, you know, learned a lot of things from this transplant, but this wasn't necessarily that successful. They're doing all right in the state now, okay? And you know, the transplants have been successful, but just not as, have done as well as we'd like. Okay, so what, you know, we're really recognizing is that as phenomenal as the Lewis and Clark expedition was, the attention that that expedition brought to the Northwest, which was good, you know, I mean, by all intents and purposes, that was the purpose of what they did, and they did a very good job. But that influx that they surely couldn't have predicted over 100 years through the 1800s really had a significant impact on our wildlife. And I surely didn't talk about, you know, bison and wolf populations and grizzly bear populations. You know, those have been in other discussions. You're probably more familiar with a lot of that. Bison were, you know, almost trapped to extinction from 20, 30, 40 million animals. We've talked about the beaver and the pronghorn. We've talked about the fisher and the swift fox. You know, today, if you pick up the paper, you know, we're looking at grizzly bear reintroductions and taking them off the endangered species list. We went from thousands and thousands of wolves in Montana. In I think 1884, we had the first concerted effort to trap wolves in the state. There was a bounty placed on wolves in Montana in 1884 to try to get rid of the wolves because of the cattle industry and the sheep industry. I mean, they didn't want wolves at all. So the state set up a bounty on wolves for the first time in 1884, and in that 1 year, 5,400 wolves were turned in from Montana. And the population of Montana wasn't very large back then, and people were centered in larger areas. They weren't spread evenly across Montana. So to have 5,400 wolves turned in 1 year from this bounty across the state just gives you a sense of how many wolves there were in Montana, you know, back during this time period. Okay? And by the early 1900s, they were trapped to extinction. They were extinct. And you're more familiar with the efforts that have happened since then to reestablish wolves. So the point is, we've gone from, you know, near extermination or extinction of many of these species since the early 1800s to concerted efforts by this state to bring these species back, as well as many others I haven't listed here. Where are we today? Last slide. Where are we today? This is the East Front, okay? Our population in Montana, the most recent 2017 census, that time period was a little over 1 million people in Montana today, from the 20,000 roughly Native American population in the 1700s, and the maybe 40,000, including the Native Americans, in the 1870 population census for Montana. We're now up around 1 million. But my point is, if you look at the Rocky Mountain front here, this is a picture I took a couple of years ago when I was over there. If you look at the Rocky Mountain front, it's ranked in the top 1% of wildlife habitats in the U.S. It's beautiful, okay? I mean, there's ranching over there, but it looks pristine. Okay, obviously it isn't, but it looks really good, and it's incredible wildlife habitat. It supports a large number of species. And it's through the, what did I do? It's through the efforts of these local groups that I talked about, the hunting clubs starting in the 1800s, the state and federal conservation organizations. I could list, 50 that are well developed here just in Missoula, in this region. Conservation organizations. Many of these started in the 1860s, again in the state legislature, efforts that occurred back then, and the state and federal agencies, all the ones whom many of you have worked for. Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the Forest Service, the Fish and Game, the Bureau of Land Management. I mean, these organizations have made concerted efforts with local and state individuals to conserve the species, that we recognize were being exterminated in earlier periods of time. So we have all of these groups, and yourselves, I'm sure, are involved with many of these conservation organizations. We have all of these people to thank for bringing these species back. If you haven't been to the East Front, you definitely ought to go over there and see this. I'm going to leave it at there. I could go on for several more hours, but I think I'll stop there and take questions. Be glad to take any questions. Yes, sir.
How has the decline of the porcupine population in western Montana and North Idaho affected the fishery?
A very good question. I actually had another graduate student who spent her career down in the Bitterroot here on porcupine, studying porcupine. It's really the other way around, okay? I think that the fisher caused the decline of the porcupine, okay? And we're in a situation right now where in the early 1900s and mid-1900s, the porcupine was kind of on a blacklist by the Forest Service, okay? The Forest Service didn't like porcupine because they girdle trees, okay? And there was a sense back then that a lot of damage was occurring to the forests by porcupine, okay? And so, a good porcupine was a dead porcupine. The Forest Service had concerted efforts to kill porcupines on site, okay? And a friend of mine who worked for the Forest Service in Montana during this time period mentioned that they were given pistols. They were given checked out pistols just to shoot porcupines if they happened to see them when they were walking through the woods, okay? And there were several locations in Montana where the Forest Service poisoned porcupines. I mean, they made a concerted effort to go out and poison porcupine populations in various stands of forest that they wanted to protect, okay? It's a long story, and I can't spend a lot of time talking about it, but the point is that porcupines don't have that significant effect on forests, period. I mean, if you've got a fruit tree in your yard and you want to protect it, yes, remove the porcupine. But they don't, porcupines aren't abundant anywhere. They have one baby once a year, if they're lucky, okay? I mean, there's no reproductive output in a species like that. They're not, they're not like a beaver, they're a rodent, but they don't have the same kind of ability to reproduce. So there are very few porcupine in the best of circumstances. So they don't have a significant impact on forest stands, period, okay? Porcupines have been declining, and we're not sure why. We've spent several years, many years, trying to understand whether it's a disease effect or loss of habitat or predation from fisher or something else, and we haven't been able to determine what's causing the porcupines to decline. This is going on from Canada to New Mexico. I've been working with biologists across the western U.S., and they're all seeing the same thing. But it's anecdotal, and they really don't know what's causing this. It's very easy to knock porcupine populations down by killing them because they reproduce so slowly. I mean, you shoot one female and you've probably taken out the population in 100 square miles. So it's really easy to knock that species down. We wanted to reintroduce fisher, to save that species, the fisher. And though they do have an impact on porcupine, they eat many other things. They're primarily focused on snowshoe hares because there's not many porcupines to eat anyway, even in a good year. So, the fisher really haven't impacted the porcupine. I don't think that's the problem. And I don't think the porcupine is declining because of that type of pressure. There are a lot of questions we just don't know. But I've worked on both of those species for a good part of my career, and haven't solved a lot of those. Yes, sir.
You've introduced the swift foxes over in eastern Montana, is that correct?
The Fish, Wildlife, and Parks introduced them over there. We were involved in the Blackfeet on the western side. Yeah, so the 110 animal, or 123, that we introduced into Montana were all put up by Browning, just south of Browning, Montana, by Glacier Park on the Blackfeet Reservation. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has done additional reintroductions themselves over in Fort Peck.
Well, I was curious if they'll go after black-tailed prairie dogs, but if you worked around Browning, there are none there.
The prairie dogs are actually pretty big for a swift fox. I mean, I put my money on the prairie dog. Yeah. I've had several grad students work on prairie dogs, so we've handled thousands of those. And they're feisty little guys. And they weigh, a chunky prairie dog can weigh several pounds. And they've got good claws too, as you're well aware. And I'm sure that a swift fox, an adult swift fox, could probably kill one if it got a hold of them and held on like hell. But swift fox are predominantly feeding on ground nesting birds. They're feeding on deer mice and voles and the jumping mice or kangaroo rats. That's a good-sized animal for them. And I think a couple-pound feisty prairie dog would, kind of stretch them.
Probably be a young one.
Yeah, they could get young ones and they could dig them out. I'm not saying they couldn't, and they could surely go after the young ones. But I don't think that. And swift fox do well. I mean, they breed well, and so you can have a significant population of those animals. So they could have an impact on prairie dog populations, but I don't, they're surely not responsible for the prairie dog declines that we see. That's plague, and other problems associated with that. Yeah.
I'm curious about the fisher, in that you said the ones that you brought in from Wisconsin back east didn't do well because of predation and deep snow, but so was there a subspecies in Montana that had adapted?
Well, what happened? Okay, the fisher that grew up here historically, that were here in the 1800s, and now we recognize never left. The short answer to what I alluded to before was Ray Vinke, who was studying the fisher with me as one of my graduate students, ended up doing the genetics on all of the fisher that we could get in western Montana. When a fisher is, they can still be legally trapped, okay? The way the state regulations are, I don't want to go there. But the way the state regulations are, fisher can still be legally trapped in western Montana. And so, and as a fur bearer, they have to be turned in to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, okay? So if you catch a fisher, you have to go to the FWP office, and they mark it, you can't have it. I mean, you can have the pelt, but it has to be tagged, so the fishing game has some record of it. Well, from those efforts, we have tissue samples, okay? So if somebody's trapped a fisher legally, and brings it into FWP, we get a tissue sample from that animal so we can run genetics on it. So Ray went back and looked at, and we save all these things, FWP does. So we had probably 100 tissue samples from fisher that had been trapped over the last 15 or 20 years or longer across western Montana, okay, legally, and plus our own genetics. And when we analyzed all of those tissue samples, what we found was that some of the animals, fisher, that are living in the Bitterroot now have always lived here. They weren't exterminated, they weren't extirpated from Montana like we thought they were back in 1920. There were no sightings and no trappers recorded catching a fisher since 1920 in the state of Montana. But we now, so everybody thought, well, they're gone. Okay, and that was part of the effort to bring them back. What we recognize now is from genetics, we did the genetics on every fisher, and some of the fisher tagged as Minnesota Fisher. Some were British Columbia Fisher. Some were Wisconsin Fisher. Some were hybrids between the transplants that we'd made, okay? But some had unique genetic, it's called haplotypes, DNA sequences. Some were genetically unique to Montana and couldn't be explained by any of the other transplants or any of the other regions. So what it meant is that they never were trapped out here. They were always here in small nuclei and were just not seen, okay? So to answer your question a little bit more directly is, if you've lived here for generation after generation after generation since the, I don't know, 1700s or whatever, okay, you become very familiar with the landscape and all the players. So you recognize a mountain lion as a threat. You recognize wolverines as a threat. And the species that have spent generations growing up in an area where there were no animals like this simply didn't recognize that threat. And so we were bringing naive animals in, not recognizing that ourselves. We're bringing these naive animals in. And then the snow conditions are also, fish have never been abundant in the cabinets. We should have recognized that. They were never abundant there, but for a variety of reasons, FWP wanted to put them into that area, okay, which we did. But the snow conditions obviously were something nobody understood at the time. Yes, sir?
Give me a small vocabulary lesson. What's the difference between exterminated and extirpated?
Exterminated, well, okay, nothing. Exterminated and extirpated. I got to catch myself because I sometimes say extinct, and I don't mean extinct, I mean exterminated. So they're both the same, okay? You extirpate them from a region, you remove them completely from a region, or exterminate them from the region. One and the same, so I should be more careful with my terms. But in my mind, I'm thinking, don't say extinct, because they're not extinct, they're back east still. Good point, thank you.
Can you say a word or two about Wolverine?
Wolverine, big. No? We've got Wolverine in the Bitterroots, okay? Wolverine populations, again, it's a species that's never going to be abundant, surely in this region. I mean, they're I don't know how you say abundant, but they're more numerous in Canada and in Alaska and those regions. In Montana, they've never been abundant by any stretch of the imagination. But they're found here, okay, and they have been historically. We have relatively healthy populations, but we're kind of on the southern border of that animal's range, okay? It's a northern species. It does extremely well in heavy snow conditions and cold conditions, and you're not going to find it much further south than Montana. I mean, we're kind of the southern extent of that. So when you get to the outer range of a species, you know, they're few and far between. They're just not as abundant for good reason because of the habitat conditions. There's been a lot of studies here. I've worked with the wolverine biologists a lot in Montana, and you know, the populations are good. They're found in several of the mountain ranges that we have around here. The healthiest population is up in Glacier Park in that area. Okay, they've got a bigger population up there. But I've taken, a lot of my research over 30 years has been setting up remote cameras. You know, I started this 25 years ago, setting up what you now call trail cameras. They weren't available back then. We had to make them ourselves. And we would set up cameras around the mountains, you know, the animals would take their own picture, essentially motion detectors moving in front. And I have had cameras down in the Bitterroots, and I've got pictures, lots of pictures of wolverine down there. And I assume they've probably come out of the missions and down through. These animals have a 1,000 square mile home range. They can move over long distances. I mean, animals that have been radio collared have been shown to move 60, 80 miles a night. Okay, you know, they're this big, and they're just going. Okay, and they just don't stop. I have another. I wish I had the slides. I could just pop up for you. I actually could, but I don't want to take time to try to find it for you. I've got it on that computer. To show a radio-collared animal up in Glacier Park that in a matter of about an hour and a half went up, swam across a river up there in eastern Glacier Park, climbed I think a 11,000-foot ridge and went down over the top. This was just in a matter of like an hour and a half. okay, climbed and it was radio collared, and the radio collar was taking a reading like every 5 minutes. You can program these things. So it had a GPS collar on it that was sending a sound to the satellites, and it was being recorded every 5 minutes. So you can see this animal going up the mountain. I mean, you know, essentially running up this 12,000-foot peak up over the top after having swum across it was actually a lake up there. So they're phenomenal, and there's a lot of evidence now, you know, of the populations that are around the state. That research is still ongoing. The other point I'll make, it's interesting, these cameras that I had set up, I had one camera set up in Grant Creek. Everybody familiar with Grant Creek, just up on the other side of Reserve Street? If you just stay on Reserve and keep going, you go up into Grant Creek, okay? And there are a lot of really nice homes up there. I mean, expensive homes up in the far end of Grant Creek. And I set up cameras. I have a friend that lives up there, and I set up a camera in the woods just as Grant Creek, as the road turns to go up to the ski slopes. Okay, so just about where that road turns, I set a camera up there in the woods, and I got a wolverine coming down through, and you know, and it was obviously coming out of the missions and into the rattlesnake wilderness on this loop. I mean, they're making, you know, a loop over a year on and off. You know, they're running around, but they're tracking different things, winter-killed animals and those types of things, depending upon the time of year. But you know, so they've got a very long kind of route that they tend to live over, their home range. And this one was, you know, I got pictures of this thing coming down through Grant Creek, and it obviously was coming, you know, through the rattlesnake wilderness and probably out of the missions. The most interesting point to that story is that my friend that lives in Grant Creek, I told him about this and showed him the pictures of this wolverine, you know, coming right down, you know, almost between the homes that were up there. And the week that I had the pictures of the wolverine, people in Grant Creek were reporting their dogs and cats missing. and they never found them.
Let's give Dr. Forsman. Molly course this last quarter, and I encourage any of you who would like to hear more of his fascinating tales to look in the Molly catalog. Take one of his courses because it was fascinating. Thank you very much, Dr. Forsman.